little fox.
The Canterville Ghost, Part 1.
When Mr. Hiram B. Otis decided to buy the castle in Canterville, everyone told him he was being foolish. There was no doubt that it was haunted. In fact, when they met to discuss the sale, Lord Canterville told him that his family had stopped living there because of the ghost. 2 skeleton hands had grasped his great-aunt's shoulders at dinner one night, scaring her out of her wits. And Lord Canterville's wife, Lady Canterville, was never able to sleep there because of the mysterious noises in the library. "My lord," said Mr. Otis, "my family is thoroughly modern, and we don't believe in ghosts." "Why, if there were such a thing as ghosts, I'm sure someone would have put one in the public museum a long time ago." "I'm afraid you are mistaken, sir," said Lord Canterville very calmly. "I assure you the ghost exists." "I tell you there is no such thing," snapped Mr. Otis. Lord Canterville didn't press the subject, and they concluded the sale. He felt that the modern Mr. Otis had been properly warned. Mr. Otis, for his part, happily bought the castle, ghost and all, as he said when he shook Lord Canterville's hand. A few weeks later, on a lovely July evening with a delicate scent of pine woods in the air, the Otis family arrived at the gates of their new castle. Sitting in the front of the carriage beside her husband was Mrs. Otis, a handsome, middle-aged woman with a healthy complexion and modern sensibility. Her oldest son, Washington, was a fair-haired and eager young man. Sitting beside Washington in the back of the carriage was his sister Virginia. Miss Virginia E. Otis was a beautiful girl of 17, with a charming freedom in her large blue eyes. When the family had first seen the castle on a visit to Canterville that spring, Virginia had challenged old Lord Bilton to a race around the park on horseback. The handsome young Duke of Cheshire had noticed her immediately, and was glad when he learned that Virginia's father had bought Canterville Castle. Seated side by side in the carriage across from Virginia were the young twins, who were attempting to steal each other's hats. They were delightful boys, but they were always up to mischief. As the carriage drove up to the castle, Virginia saw squirrels in the trees that lined the drive and watched rabbits hop away through the grass with their white tails in the air. When the carriage pulled up to the great wooden doors of the castle, however, the sky became suddenly dark and gloomy. On the castle steps stood an old woman dressed in black silk. This was the housekeeper, Mrs. Umney. "I bid you welcome to Canterville Castle," she said in an old-fashioned manner. They all followed her into the library, a long oak-paneled room with a large stained-glass window and a great stone fireplace. Tea was already set out for them on a silver tray. As the family removed their coats and sat down, Virginia walked over to examine the beautiful stained-glass window. In the middle pane, an inscription was formed in curious black letters. "When a golden girl can win prayer from out the lips of sin, when the barren almond bears, and a little child gives away its tears, then shall all the house be still, and peace come to Canterville." Just as she was wondering what the strange poem could mean, she heard her mother's surprised voice. "Oh my, I'm afraid there's a bad stain on the carpet." Everyone came to look at the dull red stain just in front of the fireplace. "Yes, madam," said the old housekeeper. "Blood has been spilled on that spot." "How horrible," said Mrs. Otis. "I don't think we want bloodstains in our home. You must clean it up." Mrs. Umney spoke mysteriously. "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor of Canterville," she said, "who was murdered on that very spot by her husband Sir Simon of Canterville 300 years ago. Sir Simon disappeared 9 years later, and his body was never found. His ghost haunts the castle to this day. The stain cannot be removed." "That's nonsense," said Washington right away. Before Mrs. Umney could protest, he pulled out a bottle of Champion Stain Remover and quickly scrubbed away the stain. "I knew it," he exclaimed. No sooner had he said these words than a terrible flash of lightning lit up the room. Everyone's heart leaped. "I have seen terrible, terrible things in this house," Mrs. Umney intoned ominously. But Mr. Otis calmly assured her that no one was afraid of ghosts. The storm raged fiercely all night, but nothing mysterious occurred. The next morning, the twins were the first ones down for breakfast. They were chasing each other around the wing-backed chairs in the library when they stopped in front of the fireplace. Sure enough, The terrible bloodstain had returned. "I don't think it can be the fault of Champion Stain Remover," said Washington, when the family gathered in the library. "It's always worked before." He rubbed out the stain again, but the next morning the stain returned. Mr. Otis locked the library that night before everyone went to bed, but still the stain was there in the morning. "It must be the ghost," said Washington, as he kneeled to clean up the ghostly mark once again. That night Mr. Otis was awakened by a strange noise in the corridor outside his bedroom. It sounded like the clanking and squeaking of rusted metal, and it seemed to be coming nearer. He got up, lit a candle, and put on his slippers. From his night table, he took out a small glass bottle and went to open his bedroom door. Right in front of him, glowing in the moonlit hallway, was a horrible sight. A terrible old man stood before him in ancient clothes, with eyes burning red. From his wrists and ankles hung heavy manacles and rusty chains. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis to the ghost, "I must insist that you oil those chains. They are keeping me awake. I have brought you a bottle of Rising Sun lubricator. It is really quite good." Mr. Otis placed the bottle on a table in the hallway and returned to bed. For a moment, the Canterville Ghost stood perfectly still with his ghastly jaw hanging open. He knocked the bottle on the floor, uttered a hollow groan, and turned back down the corridor. When he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door flew open, and two little figures in matching pajamas tossed their pillows at him. Fearing further abuse to his dignity, the ghost quickly turned into a green vapor and escaped through the wall.
The Canterville Ghost, Part 2.
When the ghost reached his secret chamber in the castle, he leaned up against a moonbeam to catch his breath. "Never before in 300 years have I ever been so insulted," he gasped. He thought back to when he had grinned ghoulishly in Lady Bracknell's mirror, and had turned her hair as white as ash. He smiled as he remembered the 3 hysterical housemaids who had found him bowling in the graveyard behind the castle, using his head for a ball. For a while he recalled, like a famous actor, all his great performances of the past. Thinking about the costumes he had worn and the screams and moans he had uttered cheered him a little. He took off his chains and passed the night watching the dim shadows cast by the moonlight creep across the stone floor. When the Otis family met at breakfast, they discussed the ghost at some length. "I think it was quite rude of the ghost not to use the lubricator I offered," said Mr. Otis. "Still," said Virginia, "I don't think it was very polite to throw pillows at him." At this, the twins looked at each other and burst into laughter. "Stop that, you two, and keep your slingshots off the dining table," said Mrs. Otis. "I think we must simply take his chains from him so he doesn't bother us again," suggested Washington. For the rest of the week, however, the only ghostly occurrence was the bloodstain in the library. Washington cleaned it up every morning, and every night Mr. Otis locked the library doors. But in the morning it always reappeared. Strangely enough, it kept changing colors. It started out as blood red, changed to royal purple, and then became flame orange for a few days. The twins thought this was great fun. Washington and Mr. Otis even started laying bets on the stain's color before bed. Virginia was the only one who seemed upset, however. And in the morning, they all came down to find the stain a bright emerald green. She nearly cried. On Sunday night, shortly after everyone had gone to bed, there was a loud crash in the hall. "What on earth is going on?" said Mr. Otis, stepping out into the hallway with a candle. Virginia opened her door and saw the twins rush past, carrying their slingshots. When she caught up, the rest of the family was gathered at the top of the stairs. Looking down, she saw the suit of armor that had stood at the bottom of the stairway scattered over the floor. And sitting in the tall wooden chair against the wall was the Canterville Ghost rubbing his knee. The twins immediately loaded their slingshots and accurately fired 2 small stones. In a rage, the ghost flew up the stairs at the family, spread his skeleton arms wide, and let out his loudest, most demonic groan. "Oh my," said Mrs. Otis, "he doesn't sound well at all. I think I'll go fetch him some cough syrup from the kitchen." But before she could start down the stairs, the ghost blew out Mr. Otis's candle and vanished in the dark. Just as the candle went out, Virginia thought she saw a sad expression pass over the ghost's face. As the ghost snuck through the dark corridors, he wiped a tear from his eye. He had planned such a terrifying surprise. He had wanted to parade through their bedrooms in the ancient suit of armor while brandishing a gleaming sword. But it had all come to nothing. He had been so worried about a sneak attack from behind that he hadn't watched what he was doing. He had knocked over the armor with his knee, and it had all collapsed on top of him. Now he just wanted to slink off to his room and bandage his wound with cobwebs. But first, he bravely and quietly went to the library and made sure the stain was ready for morning. Afterwards, he sat among the ashes in the fireplace, one of his favorite places in the castle, and made a solemn vow. "I will have my vengeance on this ill-mannered, awful family," he promised. The next night a violent storm thrashed the castle windows with rain, and the wind howled about the turrets like a lost soul. It was just the kind of weather the ghost loved. "It is time to put the fear of the supernatural into these people," he said as he looked through his wardrobe. He picked out a long winding sheet, the color of gravestone, and a thread-worn jacket with bloodstains. He planned his attack. "I'll start by scaring the twins out of their beds in the form of a green, icy-cold corpse," he thought. "Then I'll pass through the wall into Washington's room, where I'll moan hideously and stab my chest with a dagger." For Mr. and Mrs. Otis, he planned to haunt their dreams with visions of hellfire. But he didn't quite know what he would do for Virginia. She had never insulted him and seemed quite gentle. "Perhaps I'll just groan as I pass by her door," he thought. At 10:30, he heard the family go to bed. For a little while, wild shrieks of laughter came from the twins' room, but eventually the only noise was the storm outside. Just before he started out, he decided that, for an added touch of horror, he would leave his head behind. He glided through the walls of the castle like an evil shadow until he stood just outside the twins' room. The door was slightly ajar. Wishing to make a dramatic entrance, he screamed his favorite 16th century curses and flung open the door. A heavy jug of water, which had been cunningly balanced on top of the door, fell heavily onto the ghost and soaked him through to the bones. The twins, sitting up in their beds, were laughing uproariously. The ghost got up on one knee in the cold, wet puddle. When he saw the twins reach for their pillows, he let out a cry that sounded more frightened than ghostly and escaped through the floor in a flash. That night, the ghost came down with a cold. He was just glad that he hadn't brought his head, or the shock to his system might have been far worse. As it was, his nerves were completely shot. He decided to give up the stain in the library. Obviously, the Otis family had no appreciation for spiritual phenomena and didn't deserve it. Nonetheless, he did have a solemn obligation to appear on the terraced balcony twice a week, and to tread the corridors in chains every Sunday at midnight. It is quite true that his life had been evil, but on the other hand, he was very responsible when it came to his supernatural duties. And after 3 centuries, he wasn't going to give up now. When he had recovered a little from his cold, he snuck back to the hallway outside Mr. and Mrs. Otis's room. With a heavy sigh, he stooped to pick up the bottle of Rising Sun lubricator from under the table. Back in his room, he found that if he applied the oil to his chains and removed his big leather boots, he could haunt the castle hallways as quietly as a church mouse.